Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Changing the Climate, a show where we talk about the changing world around us and how we can make it better. Brought to you by Climate Change Realty. The only real estate brokerage that donates 50% of its net commissions to 501c3 nonprofit organizations dedicated to fighting climate change. Alrighty, Ro, and we're here. Hayden, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. I love what you're doing for our community and the example that you're setting for many people, so I'm excited to have you on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Ethan. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure, and what we always like to do is get the podcast started with a little bit of background on who you are and how you got to be doing what you are doing at the moment.
Sure. So my name's Hayden Dansky. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm the executive director of Boulder Food Rescue, which we're going to get totally into. How did I get here? It's an interesting question that's answered every which way, you know. I really have always kind of had this like connection to nature as a place of like healing and kind of like when I was a kid, I would just like run. I grew up in rural North Carolina, and so I would just like run around the woods, and like me and my brothers would just like go hang out by the creek all day, and that was like our lives, right? And so I felt like always like a sense of safety growing up in that kind of environment. I didn't have much connection to like food necessarily growing up, but I did witness like my mom would like engage with people in terms of like different cultures. Like most of my friends, I grew up in a town where it was like a blue collar town. We had like a chicken factory. There was like a lot of a large immigrant population there, and so like a lot of my friends were like these kids. We would just like go run around the trailer park, and my mom would like go talk to their parents who didn't speak English and would like learn about all these different cultures, right? And so like I think growing up, I kind of had a witness to what it was like to engage with people and really across food and like needs and like show up and support each other in the things that we needed outside of like maybe like a traditional system. I lost both my mom and my brother when I was 9 years old, so I like experienced like a lot of deep loss and trauma from a pretty young age, and won't get into the whole story, but from there, I like really like grew up with a single parent who like worked and put food on the table, but a lot of my like upbringing was very much like go home, make food for yourself, kind of like get on with life. And so I didn't have a deep connection to food. We didn't like eat around the table. I didn't know where food was grown. I mostly ate canned food and microwave food, and that was like my experience, growing up in a single parent household. So it wasn't until I moved to Colorado where I really started like refining my path to food and people through like what I would realize was like, oh, I could like learn how to cook from my friends. And I've always kind of learned from like peers and friends. And so we would like just gather and like share food together, right? And I started getting really excited about like what is this food that I eat every day, and like where does it come from, and I just started learning like really like how is it produced, where does it come from, how does it arrive here, what energy and resources go into that. And so I just like went down this whole world of like the environmental impacts of food and how the food system works. And then I learned about food waste, which is like, to me at that time, it was like, what, like we put so much energy into this thing that we consume every day, and then we just throw away half of it, right? That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense for the environment. It doesn't make sense for people. And so that's kind of like what I guess ended up like having me like end up in this like position with Boulder Food Rescue. Is I was like with friends, we were like, oh, all this food's going to waste. Let's do something about this. And we would have these huge meals, and everyone would gather. And I think that's like maybe a core piece of like who I am, is like I'm just a person who creates spaces for people to gather. Like I think that's like, if I could say like I have a skill, that's it. I'm a people gatherer. I like to create community, and like
it's a fun life.
It's really sweet, yeah. And like from there, I think so much emerges, right? When we get people in a room, I mean, I think this is the heart of organizing. Like we get people in a room, we start sharing oh, I'm struggling with this thing, or I have this barrier, and I, as someone who maybe like experiences a lot of shame or internalizes the struggle, it can be really hard to share that. And so when we start hearing other people say like, oh, I have this struggle, oh, I have this struggle, and when we start finding those commonalities, I think that's something that happens really in a room with food, and it's a way that we can connect across, again, cultures, across all sorts of different identities, because we have this commonality where we get to share this thing that we need to survive, but in so many different ways, and we get to celebrate our diversity and our differences and the unique ways that we exist in the world. And I think that's like something that really draws me into BFR and kind of how I ended up in this role.
Yeah, I love that. That's really cool. And yeah, one of the things people really love is trying all sorts of different types of food. And it definitely is a huge way to like cross cultural divides. Because someone's always, I mean, most people are really interested in like trying a new dish and finding something new that they love. And that's a great way for people to connect. It seems like one of the most common, like the common business meeting or like the first date, it's always like you go and like get some food.
Absolutely.
For sure. I'm curious what prompted your move from North Carolina to Colorado. And then I also, as I understand it, you were working in like the outdoor industry for like a really long time before you started Boulder Food Rescue, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of why I ended up in Colorado. So I kind of told a brief story of like, yeah, I mean, my brothers would go out a lot. Sometime in high school, some of my friends really got into like outdoor sports. I had never been camping in my life. Like, this is not my fun,
Wow.
right? So they were like, "Yo, come camping with us," and we like went out in the middle of a blizzard and like had a good time. And so they kind of got me into like um, living a actively like choosing time in nature to really cultivate for me like a sense of connection with this earth, connection with it's like a spiritual thing for me, and even though I'm alone, it's like this feeling of like never alone, right? Like just like I don't know, finding that sense of self that like I really needed. So and part of me was just like also running away from North Carolina and some of the struggle that I experienced there, certainly as a queer and trans person in the Bible Belt, but also
Totally.
as like, you know, my childhood trauma was hard and I needed to get out. And Colorado was like this big dream, like there's big mountains there, big dreamy place, you know? So I like got into climbing, I got into backpacking, I got into mountaineering, just all the things out here. And Boulder is like, I moved to Boulder. So I applied to school. I went to see you too. I got some
Go Buffs.
scholarships that like sent me here. I had never been to Boulder, so I was like, cool. That it just kind of like the things just worked out in those ways, you know. The fact that the scholarships were here instead of any other Colorado school, right? And just to
Hmm.
have the amount of access, like when I moved here, to like I could literally bike up to the mountains, like that was really freeing for me, and it's such a privilege and something that I try like to not take for granted in my life. And if I do, I usually have to leave and come back and be like, oh yeah, this is such a it is a privilege, and it's really like a need for me in my life. And so yeah, I got into like all of these outdoor sports and found my way into the outdoor industry because I would like go to the climbing gym and meet people and talk to people, and they needed more folks who weren't like white men running their trips. So they're like, hey, come on in, like you can do this. And they really like built me up and taught me like a lot of the leadership skills like that you know, I didn't have at that time, but I was able to learn from people. I didn't know how to teach, but I was able to watch. I think this is part of what I do too. Is just like, how do I watch people and pay attention to the things that they do that I really like or really land with me, and how do I like incorporate that into what I'm doing, right? So I learned how to teach by watching. I learned how to lead by watching other people and being like, oh, I wouldn't have ever thought to say it like that, but that's great. And so I really like was able to kind of I guess start like I didn't really think of it as a career necessarily, but it helped me pay my bills and get by, and also I got to like work and be outside all the time, so it was really sweet. And it was at CU that I met a lot of the co-founders of Boulder Food Rescue, so it really did like turn into like my path to this place, because I found other like-minded people who joined BFR.
Right.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah, so I'm sure that it was like a tough path for you based on what I understand. And I'm sure a lot of people have varying degrees of difficulty in their life, but I just love how you talked about how it was paying the bills, but you were out there doing what you love, and it sounds like now it's just transitioned into the exact same thing. And I don't think there's any better way to spend your time. And I really try to emphasize on this show that people, like, what you do with your career is so important. And if you're not doing something that's you're passionate about, it's just such a waste of time. But anyways, so can we talk about like the origin of Boulder Food Rescue and then kind of what it has evolved into today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree. And I don't even think to say that sometimes because I literally can't imagine myself in a
Right?
position where like I hate my job. And like I know that's like such a privilege too. Like people have to show up and like do what they need to do. And so I want to like acknowledge that. And like I don't think I'm cut out for a lot of those kind of more traditional environments. And so feel really grateful for that. So,
Definitely.
yeah, and like, how did BFR start? Well, we started learning about food waste. We There was a group of us who started doing these giant meals in our houses, like I was kind of saying, and then we were like, there are folks who need this food. We started a program called Food Not Bombs, which is actually a national. It's not. I'm not really sure if they're a nonprofit or not, but anybody can start a chapter basically anywhere they want. They kind of just like hand you like, um, here's how to do it, right? And it was started in the 80s, and it was really started as like a meal to kind of in a political statement to say like, okay, we're spending all of this like these resources and money and energy into weaponizing our country, right, and creating bombs and talking about nuclear missiles, and our
Hmm.
people are hungry, and so that's kind of how it started, and really there are chapters all around the country. Anybody could like, if this is one thing we would do when we were traveling, we just go look up the local Food Not Bombs chapter and go grab a meal and talk to people and meet people. And so there,
That's so
yeah,
cool.
it's really fun. You can cook with people too and share it, and it's just really a free meal for anybody who wants it, right? So we started that up, and there were a couple things that we learned from people who were eating that meal. We had like 100 folks out in the park. It was always a good time. People were like playing music and hanging out. And one thing we did that we didn't necessarily realize was like unique or different because we were coming at it from such a different angle was like anybody could cook, clean, serve, participate, right? Like there was no rules around like, oh, you have like if you are unhoused, you have to line up here, and if you're not, then you get to serve, right? Like we didn't have any rules like that. We are like, yeah, sure, you want to clean, great, And so we created this space where we really started to like obscure those lines between who has resources and who doesn't, like who's serving and who's being served. And what people would tell us, because it was a good mix of folks who were like, again, unhoused was like, people, people with families, people with housing but wanted to come out and eat a meal. Like it was a strange mix of folks. But people would say like, this is the healthiest meal we get all week because we were getting like primarily fruits and vegetables. And they would say, this meal is different because we all sit down and eat together. And I think those two pieces of feedback like really informed the values of Boulder Food Rescue in a lot of ways. Like we distribute food. I'll talk about what BFR is, but we distribute food, but we do it in a way of like, how do we all do this together? How do we all sit down and eat together? Is kind of the value behind it. And then another thing that was happening at that same time is a couple of the co-founders, there were 5 of us. I had graduated CU, but there were 2 others, 4 others that were there, and 2 were getting their PhDs and did this research with the data from the food bank around food waste, and they showed that there was enough food going to waste in Boulder and Broomfield County to feed every food insecure person in Boulder and Broomfield County, simply off of that food waste. But there was this big issue in terms of like optimization of like, how do we get that food to people, and what are the like, why isn't that happening now? What are the barriers the food bank has? And we found out that by the time that especially produce, like those like more perishable foods would like go from a grocery store who's donating it because it's about to go to waste to a food bank and then get sorted and then redistributed it out to a food pantry, and then that would then get to people, like 3 to 7 days can pass. And so in that system, those more perishable foods like fruits and vegetables are going to go bad. So simply because of the ways in which they are, trucking food to the warehouse, sorting it, putting it out in this like kind of big, and like, I don't want to like discredit, like they move a lot of food around, but those more perishable foods are going to go bad. And so we really created a model to take food directly from a grocery store to a community that can use it right away. And so I say all of that because that, I think, explains Boulder Food Rescue. We form relationships with grocery stores. They donate food that would otherwise be wasted. And we can talk about what that is, but it's mostly produce, is what we're focused on. And then we take that directly to about 40 different communities across Boulder. And then those communities distribute it out to people. And we do that with the power of about 150 volunteers. Right now we're doing about 12 shifts a day. Every day of the week we distribute about 1,500 pounds of food a day. And we do as much as possible by bicycle. So that was like another component of what we were doing. We were like, we're going to take all this food out of the landfill and like, remove that like waste. Like, might as well not drive cars. Let's use bikes. And it made sense at that time. But the unintended like benefits is that we engage a whole community of volunteers who might, enjoy biking, who wouldn't drive it, or who might be excited to try out biking and learn that, bike commuting is actually really feasible. I can do this. And that doesn't mean all of our volunteers bike. We certainly encourage people to be safe and do what they can. You definitely have to be physically able to bike, and so we do have car shifts, but we say as much as possible by bike, and it's pretty fun. And then we take that food directly to what the heart of our programming is now. Like, we used to take food directly to like food pantries and meal programs like shelters, the Birch House, and we do still do some of that, but I think where we really shifted and what we focus on now is what we call no-cost grocery programs. And those are programs that happen at communities, and then residents of those communities distribute the food amongst themselves. So instead of taking it to a pantry where somebody has to go out, figure out what times they're open, stand in line, have the right paperwork, qualify, get a certain amount of food, figure out transportation back, we take it directly to like affordable housing sites or preschools or daycares or places where people are already gathered. And the whole point of that is to decrease barriers to accessing food. Instead of them having to go do all of that work, it comes directly to their community room at their affordable housing site, or their neighbor's house, or the playground area, or the laundry room. And they know when that's happening. And then you can just basically go for like a free grocery shop there with what we get, right? So it's like primarily produce, sometimes some other things. And then the residents at those sites, they receive the food. They put the food out, they call their neighbors, they distribute it out, they clean up what's left. They're really in charge of that program, and they get to make decisions around how that program runs. So each one's really different. Sometimes it's a table where it's like a free shop. Sometimes it's people do like door-to-door deliveries. They have like ordering systems. It's really different depending on the program because it's what really meets that community's needs. And so that's the idea behind it, is like people actually have all sorts of ingenuity and creativity and connections in their communities. They're already leaders in their communities. How do we use food as the tool to allow them to express that and to give back and to support their neighbors without saying like, oh, we have the way it should be done in your community? It's like, no, they know what's best for their community. They're just like lacking the resources like in wages or food, right? And so they get to like enact that power.
So did you guys just look at the way the system was currently out? First off, how many years has this been going on?
10 years.
Wow. Okay. So did you just look at the system and then totally create your own model that you thought would work more efficiently? Or was there anything else similar to this? And since you've started, have you seen anything similar pop up around the country?
Yes, so there were certainly some food rescues, right? So we again talked to the food bank, understood their model. There were
Just different from a pantry.
different
You
from a
call it a
pantry.
rescue.
It is a rescue. So
Yeah.
we don't have a physical space where people can come in and get food, which comes with its
Hmm.
own challenges sometimes too, right? We're completely decentralized though. So we take it directly from the grocery store to a community. So we don't have like a space that somebody can come. Which we have ways of connecting people to food resources if they're not necessarily at one of those communities, but we're not a pantry in that way. Some food rescues did exist, but about 10 years ago, for what I actually don't know why, there was like kind of an emergence of a lot of different food rescues. There were some people who were doing, there have been some food rescues who have been around 20, 30 years even, right? So we're not the first. I think we were one of the first to kind of combine some of the elements of food rescue of the bike based model. That was pretty unique. There were some folks who were doing some bike based delivery, but not necessarily food rescue or like the nonprofit model. And then this like kind of participatory community based piece that I'm talking about, which is like kind of big buzzwords, but like where people really are engaged in their programs. That's like a form of mutual aid. That's also been happening for a long time, but really kind of combining these elements to create BFR. I think was unique in a lot of ways. And then we've just learned a lot along the way. So what BFR is now is kind of an emergence of all the things we've really learned about our community and about just different ways to do this work.
And how has this culture like evolved over the years, and how has it affected the people, whether it be the volunteers or the full-time workers who are in charge of the management of the whole organization? How has that like changed, and how are people like, what is their people's take on this model?
So yeah, I think I did mention like we've kind of shifted a little bit more, or we've shifted more into like really developing these grocery programs and like community based work. I think overall that just we can get into that a little bit too, but like it works better for people because they have agency and power over their own program. So there's like this additional element of like it's not just about the food, but there's an emotional component and there's like a mental health component of like having agency and having voice. And so that's why we've really centered that. Most volunteers who we train now, who are the like bike couriers, like the only like I think the biggest shifts is we've really put a lot of emphasis on like making sure that we sort food really well. So we're making sure we're like delivering actual good food to communities and that they don't have the additional labor of kind of like receiving bad food and like the emotional labor that comes with that. But volunteers are really down for that, right? And a lot of the model of just biking food from grocery store to community has remained the same. I think the difference now is like we connect a lot of the bike volunteers with the community volunteers, which we call grocery program coordinators, and they build relationships outside of us. So they actually even have their own communications and their own relationships and like end up like coordinating amongst themselves, which I think is super cool. Like sometimes I think our work is like really setting it up and they're like getting out of the way. And so I think that shifted. And then in terms of staff, like we started as an all volunteer program, and then we've just slowly grown over the last 10 years. And I think we're still very grassroots in a lot of ways. And there's been all sorts of challenges that come with that when you're all volunteers and you're working, two other jobs and trying to get this thing off the ground. There's challenges. When I was like the first paid staff, there was challenges because I held a lot of responsibility and too much work, right? And so a lot of the shifts that we've had to do is like, how do we like create a culture where we're not stuck in that kind of like almost it's like a framework that people have around nonprofits and almost like an acceptance of something that I think is unacceptable. Like, oh yeah, you're underpaid and overworked. That's nonprofit life. And I'm like, what if it doesn't have to be that way? Like maybe we shouldn't accept burnout as the norm, right? And so what we've really had to do, like especially as we've added more staff and now we have nine staff members, like how do we create a culture where we're totally supporting one like this community and showing up really hard, but we also like deserve to live in the world we're trying to create. Like we also deserve to like have breaks and like take time away and be paid a livable wage so that we can also show up for ourselves, right? And that can be a challenge, unfortunately, especially in the society. It can be a challenge. And so I think that's kind of like what we're trying to shift towards. And we still have a lot of work of like kind of crawling out of the hole of being overworked and underpaid for a long time.
Totally. I think that might just be the general theme of the 2000s century. It's just what if it doesn't have to be that way? I think so. I hear a lot of I hear a lot of this you have this inkling towards decentralization and community leadership, and I definitely want to speak a little bit to that, why that's so attractive and how you've seen it work really well over the years with what you've been building. And you have this idea of like shared leadership at Boulder Food Rescue. So I just wanted you to speak a bit to that and why it's so appealing and how it's worked for you over the years.
Sure. Yeah. So like, when we talk about shared leadership, we're talking about how do we do this on like many different levels. So when we talk about it at the grocery programs, like on this programmatic level, I had to, and maybe I should say like, I didn't understand. It kind of just makes sense. Like you give food to folks and you're like, what do you want to do? Do you want this? What do you think? You know, like, so it feels very simple in a lot of ways, but it's actually can be complicated because people have different ideas and they might be different than what your ideas are. And as a person who's in a position of power, it takes a lot of like recognizing that and like not saying like, oh, I don't have any good ideas, but making sure that like I'm really taking into account different perspectives. And a lot of humbling, right? Like a lot of like watching your ego crash before you over and over. You're like, okay, I don't know. And it can take a lot of emotional work. It can take a lot of labor. And so I think a lot of nonprofits don't do that. They simplify labor by saying like these are the rules, this is the way it has to be, you have to line up at the pantry at 9 a.m., you know, you have to take a number, you have to fill out this form, and they're stuck to the same. They're also beholden to systems that are maybe outside of their power, like oh, the government funding needs this, you know, oh, we have to track this amount of data, which can be hard for maybe like undocumented people to go fill out data, right? But they need it for some report, right? And so like they're also stuck in this system that's maybe not working, but it's just easier. And so they create these rules and this like way of being that makes it easier for them, but I don't think it necessarily works better for people, right? People don't have agency or voice or power or even the ability to give feedback. Or if they want to give feedback, it comes at a big risk. And I think oftentimes people in power don't understand that or see that. We have a resource that somebody needs to survive. There's power in that. And so you can't be like holding this resource and be like, tell me what you think of me without like developing like some like sense of like trust, right? That like if you tell me something honest, that's maybe hard for me to hear, that I'm not going to keep this resource from you, right? And that takes trust and that takes relationship building. And so I think our work in terms of sharing power, when we say we want people to trust us, we have to show we trust them. And so to do that, we have to really develop structures where people actually have power over their own decisions and their own programs and their own communities. And that does take a lot of work and time. And I think it's often not seen by funders necessarily as beneficial, right? It's not seen by even, it takes, you know, I could talk about this for hours just to get at like why it's important. And so that can be hard to explain in a 100-character count, you know, answer to a question on a grant. So I think typically because that work is underfunded too, and it does take time, it can be hard to do. And I think it's super important because what happens is people develop programs that work better for people. They work better for people because they know what works best for them. And so that's what we're doing programmatically. And then we kind of have to do that internally as well. As we do have some amount of hierarchy, right? It's a short hierarchy, and we make sure that that hierarchy has structure in place for people to give real genuine feedback where they're not going to feel like, oh, my job's on the line, right? And I hear that all the time from folks who like maybe work a job where they don't trust their boss, or they feel like we have to, again, we're holding a resource that people need to survive, like money, right? And so if you're in a down power position, it can be really hard to give real genuine feedback. And so it's our job as leaders, I think, to create the systems and trust where people, and that means also not just having the system in place, but how do you respond when somebody gives you feedback that's hard to hear? Are you open to it? Are you reflective of it? Are you accountable to your actions? Like, do you apologize for the harm that you cause? Because we're going to cause harm to people. That's what humans do. We're messy. We're all just like a bunch of messy balls bumping into each other, causing harm. So
emotional.
It's true. And so like,
but we get better over time.
We heal. And yeah. And so like, I think our work is really like being in process, being accountable to that harm, doing things differently. And people learn, oh, I can show up and be in this relationship. And that's my work too, even as a leader, of doing it with other folks. It goes both ways. And so how do we create those places where people feel like they can, and not just give feedback around hard things, but be their whole self at work. Like we don't, like you talked about being in a job that you love. I think we attract a staff team of people who want to work where they don't have to like compartmentalize themselves to show up to work, to be like, oh, that's my personal life and this is my work life. And there's some amount of that because we're humans and that's what we do. But like, we get to be our full identities as, you know, there's a lot of queer people, there's a lot of trans people, there's a lot of people of color. How do we all come together across, you know, multicultural group of folks and like get to be our whole selves and learn from one another, right? How do we get to be our like emotional, messy selves? You know, what happens in our lives affects us. If somebody has a loss or a hard time, it affects us. So we get to like share that with our team. And I think that's some of our work too, is like letting people be their whole selves and then also take the time they need to like be away from one another. It's not like you have to share everything. It's just like, the space is there if you need to, and it's also okay if you don't need to. And so I think it's like creating a community of people. It's like Martin Luther King talks about beloved community. I think that's like what we're really trying to create at work with one another, and like laugh a lot and play a lot and have fun along the way, because this work is hard, and I think we deserve to like also have joy in our lives. That was a long answer. I'm sorry, I just kind of went for
that
it.
That was an amazing answer. It was like a sonnet. Oh, I love it. The picture that you paint of your community is so beautiful when you talk about all the different people from different backgrounds coming together and coalescing. And not only that community, but what you're doing is truly spectacular. And there's no doubt in my mind you've helped thousands of people over a decade, and it's great. And then here comes the but. Wouldn't we love to see a world where food didn't need to be rescued? I am sure this has crossed your mind over the years so many times. How could we reform this system so programs like this, as amazing as they are, as much as they are beyond a doubt making the world better today, I personally am always focused on systems change because it's so obviously necessary. So I wanted to ask you, what have you learned about the food system over the last 10 years while you're helping all the people, while you're fixing or mending this truly broken system? How has your thoughts evolved on how we could potentially like fix it or make it better? I'm not sure. I just really wanted to get into this with you.
Oh, I love it. And I so appreciate that, because I feel like a lot of times nonprofits fall to like addressing the symptoms of that system, right? And we can get really stuck there because there's a lot of them. And we're just going to keep putting all of our energy into like, you know, giving food to people. But giving food to people isn't going to solve the reason why people are hungry, you know, which is like strange, right? We would think maybe that that's true. But, you know, here's something I've learned, right, to get to your question. I've learned about, charities and nonprofits. And like we can see, like with the rise of food banking and, or I should say, emergency food relief, giving food to people if they're hungry. Food insecurity rates haven't gone down. In fact, they've only like kind of maybe gone up, or they really follow the similar rates as economic insecurity rates, right? Because we live in a current system where most people don't grow their own food and like, right, and like feed themselves off the food they're growing. Most people go to the grocery store and buy food here in the. I'm in a very U.S. context here, but that's what we do. We go to the grocery store, we purchase food for ourselves. So in order to get food, what we actually need is money. And so food insecurity is really a result of economic insecurity. And with that, with money and the ability to go to a grocery store and get the foods that we want and need to be healthy, there's choice. We can get foods that are familiar to us. We can get foods that look and taste good to us, right? We can get foods that we know how to cook with. When we don't have access to money, and we have to use emergency food relief, like food banking or food pantries or even Boulder Food Rescue, we lose that access to choice. We get the foods that they have. Maybe there's like limited amounts of produce. Maybe there's like certain amounts that you can get. You can take 3 cans and 2 apples. There's lack of access to choice around like when are they open? How am I going to get there? What types of information do I need to get there? Or even like, oh, I have to qualify, so I have to make a certain income level. If I'm just over that, we see that with SNAP, which is food stamps, all the time. People who are just over their amount, they don't get any access to food stamps, but they still can't afford food, right? And so having to qualify. Or if I get a raise, I'm going to lose my food stamps, which actually hurts me, right? And so
That's like that painful margin. I've heard of that, where
absolutely.
people can get stuck in poverty because it doesn't make sense economically to make more money, because then you're like screwed.
Yeah, pretty much. It's called the cliff effect. You lose your benefits and you end up hurting yourself more. So that was a random kind of tangent, but that's something that we're not actually addressing the root cause, right? The root cause being economic insecurity, and we can get into that a little bit more if we want. And then we see the food waste side of things, and they're almost like they both ultimately have the same root. I would say like lots of things lead back to some of the same root causes of like capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy. When you look at these big systems, but they're almost like, I feel like sometimes food rescues fall into the trap of trying to address both simultaneously. I mean, like this is what we say: we take the food that's going to waste, we feed it to the people who need it. But if food insecurity root cause is like economic insecurity, lack of access to living wages, lack of access to like fair employment, housing, these things that affect people's like economic security, and housing's totally intersecting with that. Food waste is also like isn't necessarily going to solve that. It has its own kind of issues, and it's ultimately leads back to this like idea that like right now food waste is still profitable. Grocery stores benefit if they overstock their shelves because people are more likely to purchase food if they see abundance, right? It's like
it's a wild world.
Yeah, when you're at that party and there's one cookie left on the plate and you're like, I want that cookie, but I'm not going to take the last cookie. Like that happens. Like when there's less, like we don't take it. And so when there's more, people are more likely to purchase more. So it's profitable for them to overstock their shelves. And then also we're more likely to purchase things that look perfect. You have your, no bruises on your apples. You have your iconic carrot, and if it has like a funny divergence or something, you're not going to get that one. And that makes sense. If you're going to spend your money, you might as well get the one with no bruises. Like it totally makes sense. But it doesn't mean that apple's bad. You just got to cut off the bruise, right? And so they're kind of also like beholden to this like kind of demand of like consumer perfection and what we need. And so those are the foods that we often see are going to waste. Sometimes it's like slightly damaged things, funny looking things. Sometimes it's just that they got a new shipment in and they have also to maximize profit, they're gonna and this might be way too much detail, but they're gonna like maximize the floor space and how much they have out for consumers, which means their back end space is very small. They don't have a lot of room for storage. And so once something comes off the shelves, it's got to go out right away, which is also one reason why we pick up from a lot of grocery stores every day. They're pulling food off those shelves sometimes 3 times a day. Sometimes we do 2 shifts a day. And so it's a lot of food waste. And so like we need to, if we want to like address that, what we need to start looking at is how do we make source reduction just as profitable or more, right? Like,
Exactly.
how do we actually, because you would think, oh, like not spending the money on purchasing that food and trucking it across the country would be cheaper, but for some reason, because of subsidies and the ways they work, because of like what's incentivized, even like, and this is like probably ruffles the feathers of a lot of like food donation charities, but like it's incentivized for the grocery store, which is great. Like grocery stores get tax credits if they donate food. That's great because then they're more likely to donate food than to throw it away. But it doesn't necessarily incentivize source reduction, right? And so it's good for us because we're more likely to get more food that we can take to people. It's better for than going into the landfill or even to the compost. Like we'd rather feed people than the compost too. But we also need to look at how do we get really creative around the ways in which that we can stop purchasing that food in the first place, shipping it over in the first place, and that's like another big world of like what that looks like.
Well, I mean, this is the economic security thing. I don't have anywhere near an idea or an answer for that. It's something I've been thinking about lately. How like I've been like the other day I was like drawing on my board how like the world's money is like can be split into like triangles, and like the smallest percentage of of one triangle has like all of the money, and then the other side has like none of the money, and then like there's this big part in the middle where a lot of the resources are. And it's something, and it's interesting how I've tried to find a way to not specifically focus on one political issue in order to help as many people as possible. I've focused on climate change because I figure, okay, everyone lives in the climate, I can help everyone by helping that, and then you find out that it's all connected and there's no escape, and you have to try and fix everything if you want to fix one thing, in at least when it comes to like the environmental issues. So that's been hard for me when I'm trying to be like rigidly focused. But I really believe in this idea that I don't think that the society is like horribly tyrannical, worst it's ever been. I think that humanity is generally doing better than it's ever been before, but that doesn't mean that we can't continue to improve off of that. And there's obvious specific points, like talking about trucking thousands of pounds of produce out of a grocery store that would have been thrown out. It just seems like an obvious point of intervention that could be fixed. So yeah, I don't know. Is there anything you've thought about how, even if it was like 20 to 30% of our food wasted rather than 40 to 50%, that would be an immense improvement, you know?
Yeah. Totally. Well, and I appreciate you saying it's all connected because even though that is hard, it is true. And I think it's important because the climate crisis does affect, well, obviously people. This is the planet we have to live on. And it disproportionately affects people, right? Who maybe are going to take a bigger hit if, their property's damaged, who live in places that they can't necessarily escape. Like we see that, we see it all the time. And so we don't have to get totally into it, but I think it's important.
Well, it's all the same. We're leeching off the bottom percentage of the population in order to live. And that's how society has always been. But the reason why I'm optimistic is because it used to be 2% of people leached off of 98% of people. And now we've gotten to like 2% leeching off of like 40%. So I'm hoping we can keep, you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean when I say that?
Than me, but I don't know. It depends on the day. It depends on the day.
Fair enough.
Me. But yeah, I'm like, I don't know. You probably know better than me. What was I
It's human history.
Well, and I think there's this piece around like I think like we kind of have to address it. Like our survival depends on it, and I don't think a society that exploits people for power and money addiction like is inherently sustainable. I think in a lot of ways it's going to fail because it kind of has to. And I think that Adrienne Maree Brown's like a big inspiration to some of our work, and writes a lot about like emergent strategy and looking at nature for patterns. And but she says this one time I heard her say something like utopias are constantly being created in a dystopia, and I love that because I love like this idea of like, yes, like we are, and like these systems are big and it can feel really defeating, and we have all these little microcosms of really cool stuff happening, and like we see worker-owned co-ops, for example, like popping up a lot, even in a capitalist economy where like workers are starting to have voices and like agency and like power. That's one thing I would say, and I know we got to get back to the food waste angle, but like in this world we're imagining, I think we might need all sorts of, I don't know the answers, first of all. I have no idea what this world looks like necessarily, but I can imagine, like there has to be living wages and fair working conditions for people. And especially I would say people who are growing our food, because some of our farm workers are some of the most disproportionately affected people in these systems. Like terrible working conditions, oftentimes trafficked folks, lots of undocumented people who have no agency whatsoever, lots of wage theft, lots of like really harsh conditions, and they're the people growing our food, right? So when we look at the food system, like we need to have some type of like reform there, and I think that would actually, like it does, if we could shift to more like local and regional food producers and hubs, then we're going to have more agency in how people are treated, and we're also going to actually probably reduce food waste, because we're going to become less, and I'm not saying we should like cut out all things that are shipped across the country or world, but we could start to imagine systems where some of those subsidies that like I guess incentivize food being shipped across the world, or even foods that are like, there's a lot of subsidies for like corn and soy, which then end up producing lots of foods that are really unhealthy for people, which end up essentially like, we see like high fructose corn syrup in a lot of the cheaper foods, for example, lots of sugars, lots of soy products, and so the people who will get the foods that they can afford end up having all sorts of health disparities. And so like we see hunger is actually like intersecting with like obesity or diabetes, right? And then you have way more economic problems because you have health disparities and like higher rates of medical costs and things like that. And that's another world. But like when we start to shift, like where are the subsidies going? What is the government subsidizing? We can imagine a world where maybe local and regional food production is subsidized, and we have, because right now it's pretty expensive to buy the true cost of food locally. That's not necessarily accessible for everyone. And there are programs like Double Up Food Bucks where you can double your SNAP dollars at the farmers market. There's cool things that are happening around that. But maybe we start to imagine worlds like that where that would actually reduce food waste, because food's like there's less trucking costs, and we lose food in shipment and things like that. But we could also like maybe have more agency and voice over the foods that we get, right? We can imagine maybe systems where like food waste also happens at the farm level. They won't harvest food if it looks funny, because their consumers aren't going to buy it. So we can start to shift, well, what will consumers purchase? Or could you purchase it? There's cool programs happening on this, like purchasing like ugly foods or imperfect foods, right, at lower cost. Could we like incentivize harvesting at a farm? And the farm workers and laborers don't have the resources to do that. So, like, are there alternative systems where we can pay for that food so it doesn't just fall on the farmer to figure it out, who's already, like, struggling to make it do? But get that food at the farm, right? So it happens at the farm, it happens in transport, it happens in the grocery stores, right? We talked a little bit about source reduction, incentivizing that. Like some grocery stores are starting to figure it out, repurposing foods internally. This is still kind of within this capitalist framework, but we can imagine cutting it down a little bit. Whole Foods is figuring this out, which kind of makes sense because they're owned by Amazon and they're really good at figuring these types of things out. But like something that's going to go to waste, you can then turn into a prepared food, and then someone's actually going to end up paying more for it. But a lot of those prepared food bars actually end up kind of creating a little circular economy within the store. And then like at the consumer level, like humans will go buy food. I said humans. People will go buy food at the store. We take it back to our one of those weird human things. And then we're like, I think that's accurate. And then we like throw away most of what we produce. And that's often because, you know, some of us
The
are busy,
worst.
right? We forget about things. It's going to happen, but there is a little bit more like awareness and education from that individual level. And that is where a lot of food waste happens, right? And so if there's ways that we can like, you know, reduce the amount that we buy at a time or like repurpose it internally, things like that, then we can at least start to make some of the steps to addressing some of that food waste.
Well, Hayden, thank you so much for sharing. That was perfect. I think we've covered the food stuff on this topic, on this podcast, fair enough. And I'm just getting started on this topic. I'm going to be talking to people who are looking at the system from a higher level. And I think consumer preferences is a huge factor. And the thing about it is consumer preferences always change as society changes. And I personally believe that society can change based on the actions of leaders and individuals working together. So I have a lot of faith. And like I said, I appreciate everything you're doing. So yeah, that's great as far as Boulder Food Rescues. But before we finish this podcast, I wanted to talk about something else that you're doing, that you have this other project. You just recently released this book. And I wanted to just talk about the impact that art and poetry has in your life, because you obviously have this strong connection to the people you work with. You love this community way of looking at life. I don't even know what I'm saying. But yeah, I just love to talk about art and poetry if I can manage, because I'm always talking to like scientists and economists and stuff. But this is a good way to end the show.
Totally. I appreciate you bringing it up. Yeah, and I can totally get into all the like crazy systems change that we need. And I appreciate. I will get into art and poetry. I just want to appreciate you for asking those questions, because I feel like so many nonprofits don't like. Our goal, right, is to work ourselves out of a job, and it's really important for us to talk about even the ways that we're beholden to these same systems, and that we actually need to stop trying to protect ourselves and really say what's happening, and look at ways that we don't exist anymore.
That's huge.
Right? And so I just wanted to appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. You're the first nonprofit leader I've heard say that, so that means a lot. I'm glad that you said that.
Yeah, it is unfortunate to see like, oh, a lot of the nonprofits are actually just working, like not addressing the root cause, not holding corporations accountable, people who don't pay their workers well, because they need those people to be coming in the doors to make money. And that, like, I'd rather go out fighting with the truth than just keep on like living the lie, I guess. Hey, that's a great lead into art and poetry.
Send it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, for me, there's this what writing does is helps me externalize things that are happening internally that I don't even know. You know, it helps me like create link. Okay, Dominique Christina, she's a poet. She says words make worlds, and I love that, because it's like, Bell Hooks, who just passed away, also talks about like we have to imagine a world to be able to like. Oh, I'm just butchering this quote, but she talks about this like it's really important to like have like. We have to imagine a world if we're ever going to like make change and be in it, right? And so what I think art and poetry does is it enables me to create language and worlds around things for my own healing and my own process of like growing up in this world, right? And there's also this creative element that I think is really important for me to connect to, because one thing I can do, as we just went off into the tangent around systems change, is like intellectualize as a way to not like, it's almost like it's helpful and it's fun and it's cool to think about these things, but it can disconnect me from the actual emotional experience that's happening. If I can just figure it out, then I don't have to feel it. And so what art and creativity can do is like actually help me connect to, oh, actually this world can be pretty painful sometimes, or scary, right? Like the climate crisis is scary. And so it's a different way of expressing that helps me connect to the emotional components of what it means to be a human in this world. And so I do this a lot through like performance poetry in particular. I think it's my jam, because like there's the writing element and then there's the performing element, and that's where I think loop back to the beginning, expressing that you might not believe this, but I used to be like really withdrawn and shy and like totally mute. I like barely talked to people.
I believe everything.
Cool. Like I like was like this like shy withdrawn kid. I like didn't know how to talk to people, and so now like I'm in this place where it's like, oh, I'm like expressing these like deep emotional internal worlds to people, and people are like, whoa, I feel that, or I've experienced that, or your shame looks like my shame, right? And to like name those things helps create this like connection that I think that we all need to heal. Like saying the truth is important because a lot of us don't know how to do it. We don't. I grew up in a world of like secrets and gaslighting and trauma, and like I didn't know how to share what was going on because it was too scary. I didn't know if it would be held. So like, I think that process helps us like unlearn those things and like learn how to be in connection with people. And so I really love that. I wrote this book about like I guess that like the unlearning of shame and like learning how to like find myself, and that's like through a lot of my experiences and identities. It's kind of like a memoir of poetry. It's called I Would Tell You a Secret, and it's like kind of like deconstructing the narratives and like finding out like, well, who am I, and then offering that to the world to hopefully allow people the space to go through their own process and become whoever they are, and honor that and their differences. And so that's my poetry world.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. Where can people buy the book?
You can get it online in like Bookshop or Amazon, or you can get it through
Classic.
me. So if you go to haydendansky.com, you can find my performance poetry and the book, and that's actually preferred because Amazon takes large cuts. Bookshop, they take large cuts, so it's always nice. And I can like write you a note and send you it in the freaking mail, just like connect with you, and so you can just get it online there, and I'll send it to you. So haydendansky.com is the easiest place to get it.
Yeah, well, Hayden, you're super inspirational. I appreciate you coming on the podcast today, and I definitely like to ask that question when I have the opportunity because I really believe a lot of the best art comes from trauma, first off, and then second off, when you're able to take what's inside and create something external out of it, I really feel like there is this healing, this soothing process, and then when someone else is able to read it, they'd be like, wow, I'm not alone, this exists, and if maybe I can, whether it's a song or a dance or making a film or a podcast or whatever, I like to write all of my ideas on the whiteboard. It helps me get all my ideas out, even though I could just type them. I just like drawing the ideas and then staring at it as an image. It's really beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. My last question would just be, what advice do you have for someone who's like trying to find their place in what we talk about, like an unjust world?
Yeah, I love that question. I would say first thing would be like, well, what calls you, right? Like, what keeps you up at night? You mentioned climate, like immigration, prison abolition, LGBTQ rights, indigenous solidarity work. When you're talking about like what is that thing? And then I would say, that's the first question one we often go to, right? Because like the what is often how we define ourselves. Like, what do you do for work is like a classic question. I think it maybe even more. I don't know if it's more important, but equally important would be like, with who and how, right? Like, who inspires you and why, right? Like, what do they say that motivates you? How do you feel when you're in that space? Do you feel like you get to be your whole self? Like, is this the community that? And I'm personally someone who thinks like, if you want to find your place, like figure out what's going on and like, out of those what's, like who's doing what, and like connect, because we can't do it alone. Like we just, we can do some of our work alone, but most good ideas come in connection. We need each other to really do this work. We are communal people. And so, figuring out what organization, what group of people, who do you want to be in connection with? Maybe it's your friends too, who are the people that feel like right for you? And then I think like the other question would be like, what is your motivation, right? Like, if your motivation is around your shame or around like wanting to save other people, then there might be some like internal healing work that, is important to look at. And it's all happening all at the same time. It's not like you got to figure everything out before you can engage. Like we learn by engaging. But I think if your motivation is because, your life is affected by, the harm that's being caused and your liberation is dependent on, working on this cause, climate, is a good one, then that's motivation. Or if your motivation is that you know that your liberation is bound with other people's because we're all connected and we actually all have a stake in changing this, then I think that's a good one. And so really looking at that and doing that internal work can always really be helpful. But that's my advice. Answer those questions and then find some people.
Great advice. Hayden, thank you so much for coming on the show. And thank you so much for spending so much time helping people. I imagine I'm certain I'm not the first person who say this, but I really appreciate you. So thanks so much. And yeah.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate you too.
All right, everybody. See you soon. So if you or anyone else you know is looking to buy or sell a home anywhere in the USA and would like to create thousands of dollars in donations without any cost out of pocket, please visit ccrboulder.com today.